In this video featuring retired U.S. Army Colonel Douglas Macgregor, presents a highly controversial and pessimistic assessment of the ongoing war in Ukraine, the position of President Volodymyr Zelensky, and the health of the NATO alliance. Macgregor, a frequent commentator known for his critical views on U.S. foreign policy and military intervention, offers a narrative that sharply contrasts with the official Western stance that tend to see things in one perspective. Now let's dive into it and hear his assessment.
Given what we do know so far, what do you think are the main obstacles in terms of moving forward?
Well, first I would point out that I think in the discussions in Riyadh between the American and Russian delegations have actually gone pretty well. I think both sides are getting into the details of how you normalize relations. So I don't think there is necessarily any obstacle in Riyadh at the negotiating table. The obstacles are elsewhere. The biggest obstacle, of course, is Mr. Zelensky and his government, which is frankly judged to be both unreliable in any case and unalterably opposed to any agreement which does not restore the status quo ante, which is not going to happen. So I think that's a problem. The other problem is you still have people inside the United States who insist on seeing Russia as some sort of Soviet-like opponent. The usual mythologies about Mr. Putin's aspirations to rule all of Europe and all this kind of thing are still out there. This makes it very hard on the president. I think to some extent the president needs a supporting public relations campaign to attack all of these fraudulent statements and mythological obsessions with Putin and so forth. Now, the Ukrainian side is a serious problem. And of course, as you know, they're being reinforced certainly by London and Paris, and to a lesser extent by Berlin. I don't see anything good happening as long as Mr. Zelensky is there. And so that's why I think we're now hearing rumblings about an interim government in Ukraine, something with which both we and the Russians can work with.
But if Donald Trump, comes to his senses and picks up the phone and calls you today for advice, what would you recommend as a way forward to bring an end to this horrible war?
Well, I think there should be a concerted effort to put together an interim government with a schedule for either the United Nations or the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe to come in and supervise and monitor elections in Western Ukraine, in those areas that are currently Ukrainian. That has to happen. We have to realize that Zelensky, his attitudes, his behavior, his repeated violations, even of the most recent ceasefire agreement on just energy infrastructure, makes it extremely difficult for the Russians to take him seriously. I simply don't see any possibility that that would happen. Now, I don't know if that's all doable at this stage. I don't know what's happening in our U.S. State Department. I don't know what the private conversations in the Oval Office sound like. I simply know that if you left it up to the people in Riyadh, Russians and Americans, I think you would come to a reasonable solution quickly. Unfortunately, it's not up to them. There are many, many more actors involved.
Yeah, I saw the interview between Witkoff and Tucker Carlson, and it appears that there's more or less a common understanding now, at least on the key issues between the Americans and the Russians. I did want to ask you, though, about the proposal so far. First, of course, the ceasefire, which was proposed, mediated between the United States and Ukraine, which was just a ceasefire without anything attached to it, or unclear what would happen during ceasefire or after ceasefire. But also the more recent, I'm not sure if we can call it successful, the agreement to end strikes on energy infrastructure and also have peaceful navigation throughout Black Sea of commercial vessels. But of course, some of this has already been violated, so I'm not sure if I'm answering my own question here. What was the main point of these agreements, and what is the problem with upholding them?
Well, I think President Trump expected President Zelensky to honor his end of the bargain. Zelensky shows no evidence for doing so. I mean, when it came to the energy infrastructure, within hours of the agreement, Zelensky launched attacks on energy infrastructure in Russia. Now, you can reach a couple of different conclusions. You can assume that, well, Zelensky really wasn't interested anyway, and he wanted to sabotage it, perhaps. You could also conclude that he does not control his own armed forces, and there are people operating now beyond his control. That's also a possibility. You know, there's also concern about the Zaporozhye nuclear power plant. That's the largest one. And the Russians in particular, but also we, have been concerned about Ukrainian attempts to destroy it, damage it, causing a major energy crisis. And of course, the problem of radiation and radioactivity and poisoning the environment. Those things are still in the background. I just don't know the details. I don't think any of us do at this point. So I wouldn't say that everything is at a stalemate. I think the Russians and the Americans have discovered the common ground that they can build upon. That, I think, is pretty clear. The problem is ultimately Ukraine. And, you know, the interesting thing here is that if you're sitting in the Kremlin, you're the President Putin or Sergei Lavrov, your expectation is that we will rein in Zelensky, that someone in Washington would say, presumably the president, that's it. Either you get on board or you're out. And I think they expect the president to be able to remove him. Now, frankly, I don't see why he could not if he chose to do so. But thus far, there hasn't been a willingness to go down that road. And I think that's the sticking point. Now, the other thing before we leave this with the British and the French, I've been reading the German press, to a lesser extent the Polish press, but what you get from Germany is this realization now that if the British and the French actually moved forces to the east into Ukraine, which would be phenomenally stupid in my judgment, but if they did that Germany would have hundreds of thousands of foreign troops marching through their country. And obviously the logistical strong points or concentrations, the railways, rail lines, all of these things running across Germany into Central East Europe, into Poland, would become lucrative targets for the Russians. So I think the Germans are beginning to come to terms with the reality that that's not something they want to be part of. Their government is slow to catch on to that sort of thing, but I think the population in Germany gets it. And if you look at the most really recent polling data from Poland, it's quite clear that the Polish population has turned against this war in Ukraine, at least insofar as it involves Polish participation. And I think in Washington, there is this sort of schizophrenic personality. We should get out, leave NATO. This is a disaster. We don't want to be part of it. Versus, oh, no, we're still part of NATO. And if they do go in, we can't just abandon them. I am of the view that if the British and the French are foolish enough to undertake any sort of intervention in Western Ukraine, that we should absolutely abandon them. And we should make it very clear that we will not support it. The reason I say that is that if you take us out of the equation, Glenn, there is no command, control, communications, computers, intelligence, surveillance, reconnaissance backbone that effectively allows you to command forces across the European theater. All of that resides with us, with the United States. And when I was assigned to Supreme Headquarters Allied Powers Europe, I worked on a plan before I left that would enable the Europeans to put together what I just described, a command and control capability, a headquarters with all the supporting satellite arrays and everything else. And it was made very clear to me before I left at the time by Germans and British and French and others listen, we think you're right. This is the right thing to do, but none of our politicians will invest a dime to do it. And I said, well, if that's the case, at some point, the Americans will leave, and then you'll have nothing. And I think that's what the Europeans know. If we pull out, there's nothing there. It has to be built up from scratch.
The former head of the Bundeswehr in Germany, Harald Kujat, he was also the head of the NATO military committee. He warned actually all at the beginning of the Russian invasion that this was provoked and the peace in Istanbul was sabotaged. And he warned that this is what could happen to Germany if they walked along into this war with Biden, that at some point it would end in a massive disaster. And then the United States and others would have the opportunity to walk away while Germany would be left standing there, confronted with Russia in a war which the German had not just, in his words, they had sabotaged and broken international law by violating Minsk, helped to provoke the war, sabotaged all peace agreements, and then be faced with Russia alone. So I thought he was, kind of spot on. But it's a bit late for the Germans now to realize that, all these troops moving through German territory would make their logistics quite exposed. But of course, I do agree with you, though, the idea that the Europeans can simply fill the shoes of the Americans, replace the intelligence, the logistics, the weapons, the planning. It does sound like fantasy land. It's not going to happen. And it does appear something has changed in media over the past 2 weeks or so, in which the Europeans start to recognize that they don't really have the money, they don't have the industrial capacity, there's no political will, there's a lack of solidarity. But with this in mind, do you expect the Europeans to start to fall in line? Because they have opposed Washington very strongly. I would say they seem like they want to sabotage Trump's peace efforts. They still don't want to give up on any sanctions. They don't want to see the war end on any unfavorable terms, which means no NATO, territorial concessions, no security guarantees. Again, the foundation which America has agreed to.
Well, there's another critical event that very few people ever talk about, but one that's going to have a profound impact, and that is massive economic recession inside the United States. We are very definitely headed into a recession. Now, you'll have some people argue and say, oh, no, that's not really true. And of course, no one in the Trump administration wants to stand up and announce that. The sad truth of the matter is President Trump had nothing to do with the onset of this recession. It's not his, but he's going to be stuck with it. In other words, he's going to have to deal with it. That recession could be deep in the sense that it could border on depression. What we do right now, or what the Trump administration does, particularly regarding tariffs and spending in general, will have an impact on that recession. So I think by June, our government is going to have to make some tough decisions. Now, we all know Congress, the Senate, the House, they will not make any decisions of any value because they're incapable of taking hard decisions and making hard choices. That puts them at risk. They can't get reelected and so forth and so on. The president is different. The president is going to have to step forward, assert his authority, and make some profound changes in terms of spending and adjusting our interaction in the economic sphere with other countries in ways that he may or may not like. But what we do is going to have an impact on that recession. Now, in Europe, my impression is it's far more serious. I talked yesterday to Martin Armstrong. He's not the only economic analyst that I've talked to lately, but he suggested that it was almost a coin toss right now. Who is in the worst condition, most likely to default, if you will, London or Paris? I voted for London. I think they're on the skids, and they're likely to go under first. All you have to do is look at the bond markets, what they call, of course, gilts. And if you cannot finance your government, if no one will buy your debt, you're out. We are very nearly there now. Japan faces something similar, but France and Britain in particular have an acute problem. So the notion of spending hundreds of billions of euros that you don't have that you're not going to be able to create and then finance a major military campaign against the Russian state at this stage is absurd. So the British population, by some estimates, is very close to civil war, particularly in England. I don't know. I'm not there. I can't evaluate it. And I know in France, the revolutionary fervor is sort of just beneath the surface. The proverbial pot is coming to a slow boil. I don't know that Macron and Starmer and even Merz at this point are going to be there much longer. Merz may last longer than the others, but I think the whole idea right now of going into Ukraine and opposing Russia is just fanciful nonsense. By the way, I think Mr. Putin understands that, which is one of the reasons people ask all the time, why hasn't President Putin moved more decisively? Well, I think he's exercising patience. I mean, if he waits long enough, these economies in Western Europe are going to tank anyway, and those governments will fall. The whole globalist leadership caste is in danger right now of going under, which I think is a very good thing. Very good for Europe, very good for us. But at the same time, that's going to be tough days ahead for the French, for the Germans, for the British, for many people.
I was curious, what do you see in the future of Europe now? Because it's I saw also Merz giving that is the incoming German chancellor who was making a speech in the Bundestag. He was arguing that this is not just a war against Ukraine. Russia is at war with our country, with Germany. He has gone to war with Europe. We have to spend hundreds of billions to fight the Russians. I mean, to hear the German leaders speak in this manner, it's quite frightening to see it going down this path again. And I spoke to a member of the EU Parliament, the German one, and he had like more than 3 decades experience as a diplomat in the UN, and he had many good points. He was making the argument that well, first of all, they don't have the money for this, but also if they arm themselves, it's gonna not just alienate a lot of the other Europeans who might not have the best historical memories of a militarized Germany. They're going to have, of course, a possible war with Russia. They're going to alienate the Americans. I mean, the whole thing just seemed, very careless and emotional. But 3 years ago, when the Russians invaded, we were told that, well, now NATO will be stronger than ever. We have our enemy back. Solidarity will come. Finally, there's a purpose for NATO. But, of course, it's not playing out as such. What, do you think there's a possibility that NATO might fall apart? And what would be what would be the main driving forces or supporting that hypothesis?
Well, in January of 2022, I was interviewed by Dimitri Simes at the National Interest in Washington, D.C. And you can look it up and you'll find it, I'm sure, archived somewhere. And I was part of 2 or 3 other people. And they said, what do you think is going to happen? I said, the Russians will very definitely invade. And everybody else took the position of, well, that's very risky. And the Russians don't want to put themselves at risk or their economy and face even more sanctions if they do that. I said, well, this is an existential question for Russia. They will definitely go into Ukraine. And then I said, I doubted very seriously that if NATO committed to an operation against Russia in Ukraine, which we did, that it would survive the war. I said, I think by the time this finally ends, so will NATO. Look, Glenn, NATO has had no rational objective, let alone raison d'etre, for a very long time. To be frank, I was in Europe in 1992, shortly before I took command back in the United States, and we'd come back from the desert. We looked at what was happening in Yugoslavia. We knew that the Russians were in poor shape at that point. And we all said, well, the best thing we can do right now, given the international conditions, is to leave. If we Americans leave now, Europeans will have a breathing space before new actors consolidate, new nations consolidate, new alliances spring up, and they can chart their own course into the future. Well, that didn't happen, obviously. But I thought we should have gotten out of there in 92, 93, and 94, period. You can leave a tiny contingent there, but the way we're organized right now, how deeply we're dug in with our headquarters and our command and control, we should have gotten that out. And then you might see a different picture today in Europe. But NATO, much like the European Union, is an unrealistic construct. Because if you go back through European history, look at the last 500, 600, 700 years, whatever you want to do, the view from Berlin is very different from the view in Paris. The view of the world in Rome is not the same as the view of the world in Stockholm. In other words, how you see the world in Europe as a European depends very much on where you live. That shouldn't be a big surprise to anybody. But the idea that all Europeans come together harmoniously and say, we will unite forever to defend ourselves against anybody who challenges us, simply not realistic. You could never get Spaniards, Portuguese, Italians, and French excited about fighting wars somewhere in the Balkans or Central Asia or the Middle East or somewhere else. Some would, but for the most part, people didn't want to do that. And you'll remember that battle cry, NATO is either out of area or out of business. And I agreed. I said they should be out of business because there's no reason for the Europeans to sort of reconstitute their colonial empires. There's no reason for people to march into Africa, the Middle East, or elsewhere. Well, obviously, I lost that debate, and I had to go through and watch what happened in the Balkans. I was there in 95. I was involved in it in 95, 96. I went back at the end of 97 and was involved until 2000 in Kosovo. And remember, I had served previously for many years in Germany. So I've operated within this NATO framework for a long time. And it just doesn't make sense for reasons of culture, national interest. I think the same fate is likely to befall the EU. The EU may fragment first, and I don't see how the euro survives. I was sitting in Vienna when the euro was announced, and everybody was saying, oh, this is wonderful. This is uniting Europe, and everybody's going to use the same currency. And I said, but the bankers in the Netherlands and Germany do not do business the way the bankers in Italy and Spain and France do. In other words, there are different views of how you use monetary policy from nation to nation. And this is going to create more friction and more mutual suspicion than it will create unity. And of course, all you have to do now is go to any number of European countries, and everything that's wrong is the fault of those damn Germans. You know, they're the problem because they run everything in the EU. They're the ones, they stand behind the euro and so forth, so on. Well, that's nonsense. I mean, everybody has some portion of the blame, but most of us, and that's true here in the United States, we are the authors of our own problems. It's not the creation of some foreigner somewhere. But I think the Germans have been picked up and used as a useful and convincing whipping boy. And of course, the Germans have bent over backwards and said, beat me to death if you like. I'm ready to take it. After all, I'm a German. Well, all of that has to change, and I think it will change. I see that happening right now beneath the surface. So I would regard Merz and Macron and Starmer and many others as a sort of final performance of the globalist ruling class. They're all going to be swept away. We just have to be patient. We're facing something similar here. And this globalism has not worked. And that doesn't mean that the world is going to collapse and we're all going to go to war with each other. Doesn't mean that at all. But we're going to have to go back to a planet of sovereign states inside regions. And various regions will coalesce. I mean, I could imagine Scandinavia, certainly Finns, Swedes, Danes, Lithuanians, Latvians, Estonians, Germans, coalescing into some sort of Northeast European security zone. I could see an alliance emerging there. I could see a different kind of alliance down in the Mediterranean and a different alliance up in Northwest Europe, where I think in most cases the Norwegians would prefer to be allied with the British, the United States, and Canada. That's fine. I just think these things will happen. And I don't see them as frightening. I see them as natural consequences of development over many, many years. The old world order is gone. This thing we called the post-war liberal international order, which was always nonsense. It just meant the world that we shaped as Americans, that's over. We're going into new territory, and that's all right. I think things will come out quite well. I don't see this as the beginning of Armageddon at all. In fact, the good news is I think more and more Europeans are figuring out that there is absolutely nothing to be gained by going to war with anyone in Europe.
Yeah, especially the
Macgregor fundamentally challenges the narrative of Ukrainian military success. His analysis typically suggests devastating losses. Macgregor repeatedly argues that the Ukrainian armed forces have suffered catastrophic, unsustainable losses. He often asserts that Russia has decisively gained the upper hand, and the ability of Ukraine's standing army to conduct effective operations has been obliterated. A bleak military reality. He views the ongoing conflict as a long-term Russian strategic victory, claiming that Western military aid is insufficient to reverse the tide and only serves to prolong the bloodshed. The status of Zelensky. The provocative title suggests a scenario, if not an immediate event, of President Zelensky being removed from power. Macgregor's past remarks have painted Zelensky as a figure who, by refusing peace talks and prolonging the conflict on Western encouragement, has mismanaged the war effort. The overthrown angle likely refers to a potential internal or political collapse in Ukraine driven by the military situation and public exhaustion. He often suggests that Zelensky's government is losing legitimacy among its people. Let's continue with his assessment.
Prepared by Prince Gorshakov, and I think it was prepared for Alexander II. It could have been Alexander III, the Tsar. I can't recall which one. And in this particular memorandum, which then was subsequently sent to Vienna and Berlin, there was a statement in there about the concert of Europe. And Bismarck took out his pen, circled concert of Europe, drew an arrow, and then in the margins wrote, "What is the concert of Europe?" question. And sent that in to the Kaiser. And that was Kaiser Wilhelm I at the time. And they all agreed, what are we talking about? What concert of Europe? You know, but that was a different world where people came to terms with reality. It's like, you know, the Russians expressed a desire to take Constantinople. In other words, go in and liberate it from the Turks in 1879. And the German attitude was, well, what particular difference does it make to us who controls the Bosporus? It doesn't. But it turned out that it made a great deal of difference to the British. And the British threatened to go to war against Tsarist Russia if they replaced the Turks in Constantinople with Russians. Well, look at the map, look at the various peoples in Europe, and tell me how much has changed.
Yeah, well, actually, in the first book I ever published, on the first page on the opening, I used this quote by Bismarck as well. I forgot exactly the words, but something along those lines. The people who use the words Europe usually do it to demand something they would never demand to do in their own name, something along those lines. So
yeah,
it is, but it's also been convenient for the Germans, though, after World War II, that is, to dress themselves in the coat of Europe and the transatlantic partnership. It's been a comfortable way to grow. But I just want to circle a bit back to the issue of Zelensky. To what extent you think that he will be pushed out? Because a lot of the arguments or quarrels that happened in the Oval Office with Trump and Vance was because he was pushing back against the whole idea of negotiating. He didn't want it. And now, of course, I've seen him over the past few days. He seems to, again, very hostile to any compromise. He talks, he said that we don't really need a very quick peace because, Putin might die one day and this is over. which is a very strange war strategy waiting for mortality to kick in. But also, he take pictures of himself in front of paintings of the Kremlin burning and the sinking of the Moscow warship. And again, he's got his war paint on again. Even a few days ago, I interviewed Alexander Dubinsky, who was one of the colleagues of Zelensky, but he's now been thrown in prison, and he calls for the impeachment of Zelensky. But he was also making this point that Zelensky is willing to almost do anything to prevent any of Trump's proposals to go through. So do you see?
I think you missed something. Yeah. He also said that the Ukrainians would assassinate Mr. Putin. A Ukrainian team would get in there and assassinate Putin. He also implied in another statement that he could kill President Trump. I mean, these things are outrageous statements. They make no sense. But if you're sitting where President Trump is in the White House or Mr. Putin in the Kremlin, you need to reach the inescapable conclusion that this man must be removed, or nothing is going to happen. This man is going to burn down what little remains of Ukraine and its population. That's not in anybody's interest. The Russians don't want to do that. If they had wanted to do that, they would have handled this entire war very differently. We don't want that to happen. We want to see Ukraine survive. So Zelensky has to go. And I can think of several presidents. Certainly Eisenhower comes to mind. Certainly Nixon, probably Johnson, several others, that if they were confronted with these circumstances, Zelensky would be gone.
I think someone from his administration suggested that Witkoff sounded like a Russian agent as well. When America's the one country that keeps you alive and keeps the country going, it is quite remarkable the language that's being used. But how can the United States, if they decide that they don't want Zelensky there anymore, how can it be pushed out?
I would leave that to the imagination of your listeners, and if they're not terribly stupid, they will answer that question without any help from me quickly.
Yeah, a few hours ago, the former president of Russia, Dmitry Medvedev, he posted a tweet when he suggested that some new pressure might be mounting on Zelensky. I have it here. Here we go. Medvedev wrote, the Americans rolled out an excellent draft commodity deal to the Kiev freak. If the Kiev regime approves it, the drug addict will then be hanged on the Maidan like Mussolini. And if he rejects it, the United States will reset the Bandera regime. Checkmate. Again, a bit more dramatic language than I probably would have used. But you see them falling in a squeeze here, or?
Look, Europe needs peace. Europe needs peace, stability, and prosperity. How does it get it as long as Zelensky and his little cabal is loose in Kiev? I don't think it's going to happen. They're going to do exactly what was described. Hang on to the bitter end. And then you end up on the Titanic. And we know how that ended very badly at the bottom of the ocean. We don't want to do that. We want Ukraine to recover. We want the population, to the extent that it can, to come back. Many, many will never come back. We know that. But we want to try and get as many as possible to come back. We want it to become a productive and successful country. We're not going to get there with this man, Zelensky, or the people around him. And I think this is also something that is embedded in the goals of the special military operation. They want Ukraine to be neutral. They also want it to be denazified and disarmed. And I think those things have to happen. I don't think Russia is going to have any objections to an armed force in a neutral Ukraine, provided it doesn't resemble what they had to fight in the war. I mean, it's much the same as Austria. That's why I always mention the Austrian model as the most appealing one for application in Ukraine. it could be done. But the Austrians themselves really brought the Austrian model to existence. They did all of the hard work between Eisenhower and Khrushchev, the Soviets and the Americans and the other Europeans. They drafted the treaty. They got everybody to approve it and sign on for it. We're not going to get that from Zelensky. So we absolutely need new leadership in Kiev. The longer it takes to get there, I suspect the further the Russian forces will advance.
Yeah, and well, this has been my great concern as well. That is, if a diplomatic solution is not found, which is why I'm very annoyed that the Europeans are still opposing this. Again, the longer it takes, the more we risk a complete collapse in Ukraine. And as you and I have discussed as well in the past, it's really in the final stages of the war when really the casualty numbers, again, I don't have to tell you as a student of war, but this is when the casualty really takes off, when the troops are surrounded, they have to surrender, you're having disorderly withdrawals, you're having massacres, breakdown in communication. It's just, if this happens, not only, again, from a humanitarian perspective, would it just be a complete horror show, but the destruction of Ukraine, that is loss of all of these men, as well as even more territory, it would be impossible almost for Ukraine to recover after this. And that would not be great for anyone, I think, because it's not a recipe for stability. So to have a whole country destroyed. So it's a bit remarkable for me that, I stand with Ukraine crowd that they don't seem to understand what they're actually putting into place here.
Well, both Moscow and Washington should be very interested in ensuring that this war ends and another war does not spring forth from it. In other words, there is some sort of, nothing lasts forever, but hopefully a more enduring stability and peace and prosperity in the region that we otherwise will miss. What we don't want is a situation that brings on another war. And that's my concern. The Europeans, for some reason, seem hard over. When I say Europeans, I'm talking principally about the British, French, and to a lesser extent the Germans, seem very interested in keeping these fires burning. So even if you get the most of the fire out, you have embers that you can subsequently stoke in the future. This is catastrophic. Makes no sense.
The former head of German intelligence, he also made the argument that it would be good to keep the war going for another 5 years, so it would distract the Russians while Germany, to shield the Europeans from any Russian aggression and allow the Europeans some time to rearm. And this was something that really put some shockwaves throughout Ukraine, because they kind of been running with the narrative that we stand together, the Europeans are here to help us. I think they're slowly coming to the realization that they're being used as meat effectively to, against the Russians. So I think there's going to be backlash. But just as a final question, the Russian position, again, if in these negotiations between the Americans and the Russians, do you see any areas where the Russians might be willing to come meet them halfway or make some compromises? I know the neutrality issue, which encompasses both NATO expansion and security guarantees, that also troops in Ukraine, that this is likely non-negotiable. But on any of the other issues like demilitarizing Ukraine, the extent of territory, do you see any scope for possible negotiation on these issues, or not really?
That's hard to know. I think that the Russians have always been more flexible than we think, provided we met certain minimal conditions. In other words, the neutrality is one of those. The recognition of the territories they currently hold as being Russian, an end to all this nonsense about Crimea and so forth. I think they're very flexible once you get past those. Again, the question is, when the fighting stops, where do they stand? And you have to think like a Russian. How far back are you willing to withdraw? And why would you withdraw without being absolutely sure that the new government in Kiev is not going to be in some way or another influenced by the hateful crowd that runs it now. And what about this thing called NATO? I don't think NATO is going to be around much longer, so I think that'll be less of an issue. And as far as the Germans are concerned, I think the Germans need cheap energy. They need to restore that. And I think the Russians are willing to do that. But the way the Germans are behaving right now, it's not going to happen. And that's not because the Russians are afraid of a re-emerging German juggernaut headed towards them. Remember, Putin spent plenty of time in Germany. He knows the Germans and the Austrians. There's no interest in marching east to achieve the kinds of extreme goals that were on people's minds in 1941. I think they know that. So I'm not concerned about that. I'm more concerned about, this poisonous atmosphere that people like Merz and others continue to create by imputing to the Russians things that are wrong, that don't exist, imputing to them aspirations they don't have, a determination to march west and do what? Drink better coffee in Paris? It's absurd. They don't want to do it. There's no interest in it. I sometimes say, have you been to Russia? 99 times out of 100, they've never been there. Well, anybody who's been to Russia for any length of time, and I have, you've discovered very quickly nobody there is interested in going to war. And then people say, yeah, but what about this man Putin? Well, I don't think we've had anybody at the top of the Russian power structure over the last 100 years that is more concerned about avoiding war with the United States and the West than Putin. And he's determined to avoid that. He wants a prosperous, stable Russia. That's it. And he certainly doesn't need any territory, as he pointed out recently. They don't need any territory. And sadly, that was Bismarck's point as well. The Germans needed no more territory than what they had. And they didn't want anybody inside the empire who was not a German. He used to point to the 2 million Poles and say, we have enough trouble with them. We don't want anybody else in the empire who's not German.
Yeah, no, it's I spoke also a few days ago with Ambassador Jack Matlock, because he helped to negotiate an end to the Cold War, and he had a fascinating comment. He said that part of the problem was the war hawks on both sides, because he said within Washington, as well as they had those in Moscow, of course, but there were a lot of more the war hawks who said, you can't have diplomacy. Reagan shouldn't start diplomacy because you can't trust anything the Russians say. So overcoming this narrative and this insistence that you can't talk to the opponent, you can't do diplomacy. But once they were able to push through that, of course, they could reach an end. I wish we would learn something from this, but I doubt it.
Well, the interesting thing is, whether or not you like Donald Trump, you must give him credit for having the courage and the determination and the vision to smash down what remains of the Cold War and bury it in favor of normalizing relations with Russia. Europeans should take that as a blessing. I remember when the Europeans were frightened during the Reagan years that they would end up in the middle of a large nuclear exchange because they were convinced that Reagan wanted to nuke Russia. How things change. It's almost to the point where it doesn't matter who's president, whatever the president says or does, Europeans don't seem to like it, but they should be much happier with with Trump, who is pursuing peace.
I agree. And I think it's a bit of an irony that we triggered this war to expand NATO, and as you said, now NATO might die as a result of it. But again, here we are. Colonel Macgregor, it's always a great pleasure to speak with you, and thank you so much again for your time and your insights.
Sure, Glenn. Best to everyone.
The Colonel's critique extends beyond Ukraine to the integrity and future of the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, disunity and exhaustion. Macgregor argues that NATO unity is a facade, strained by differing national interests, economic pressures, and a lack of common commitment to the collective defense required to truly challenge Russia. Strategic failure. He frames the Ukraine conflict as a monumental strategic miscalculation by NATO and the U.S. one that has strengthened Russia, driven non-Western nations closer to Moscow, and depleted Western military stockpiles. Financial burden and public discontent. A major point is the unsustainability of the financial and military aid flowing to Kyiv. Macgregor posits that this spending, combined with rising inflation and domestic issues, will lead to public and political backlashes in key NATO member states, ultimately causing the alliance to fracture or become irrelevant. It is essential to understand that Macgregor's commentary is highly contested. His views are often amplified in circles critical of U.S. foreign policy and Western involvement in the conflict, and they have been criticized by mainstream military analysts and policymakers for overstating Russian capabilities. Critics argue Macgregor downplays the significant losses and logistical failures of the Russian military, exaggerating Ukrainian casualties. His figures for Ukrainian losses are often significantly higher than intelligence estimates from allied nations. Undermining alliances. His emphasis on NATO's imminent collapse is countered by the alliance's recent expansion, Finland, Sweden, and a demonstrated increase in defense spending among many member states. In summary, Colonel Macgregor's video is a platform for his recurring and controversial thesis that the West's policy in Ukraine is fundamentally misguided, leading inexorably to a Ukrainian defeat, the political demise of Zelensky, and a crisis of confidence that threatens to unravel the NATO alliance. The video serves as a forceful argument against continued intervention, urging a re-evaluation of Western strategic priorities. Thank you for watching. Please don't forget to help us by subscribing. Leave your thought on the comment section and like this video, and as well share it. See you on the next one.